You should be good to go now on the recording.
Okay. Oh, and I can share now. Thank you. Sorry about all these difficulties, guys. But okay, cool. Thank you for turning out. I didn't even realize this was a 3-day weekend when we scheduled it. So, thanks for sharing your Saturday morning with me. We're going to be going over calculating benefits from community composting. This might be a little bit dense in the, calculation and math space. I did my best to try to break it down, um, pretty simply, but there will be this recording and I'm happy to share the slides if you ever need to come back and reference. So thanks for sending out that email, Courtney. Agenda for today, we are going to be discussing different methodologies for documenting positive externalities of community composting. We're going to be looking at how you can calculate this, different databases out there that kind of aid in the calculation, some online tools that can be helpful in this space, and then just some thoughts on on-site monitoring, seeing exactly what your specific site is doing. The outcome that I think we're all hoping for is that you can use these types of metrics to apply for funding or show progress and community benefits to different partners that your organization works with or different community members, any other stakeholders that, it's always good to show this type of stuff. About me, if I haven't met you already, I'm Naomi. I worked on the CCGS 2 diversion tracking app. So I think many of us have emailed about that before. Before that, I was a compost site operator, worked with the CCGS 1 program. And then outside of that, I've been a climate and environmental analytics consultant for over 10 years. I'm day to day working in the greenhouse gas calculation numbers, always have an Excel document open. So this is kind of my world. So if you have any, questions that pop up, um, feel free to email me, put my email in here. Always happy to help with this sort of stuff. So externalities, kind of a weird word. But I'm sure you guys have heard this before. It just means a secondary or unintended consequence of some, action or producing a good. So it can be positive and negative. Positive externalities when consuming or producing a good causes a benefit to a third party. Negative would be producing a cost to a third party. We can argue a lot of benefits from community compost are, direct benefits that we actually want. But this term just comes up a lot when, applying for grants, that sort of thing of like, what what are all of the benefits that we're seeing from community compost that isn't just, diverting from landfill. So I know we only have a few people here right now. I put together a poll, but it might just be better since we have a smaller group, um, to just kind of unmute yourself and shout out what specific to your site are some positive externalities. It can be anything at all that comes to mind after hearing that definition.
Hello, good morning.
Good morning.
Yeah, I guess that applies to all the this applies to all the compost sites, but probably avoiding CO2, actually methane in the atmosphere, and avoiding um, recycling the compostable trash. from the households and educating people, producing soil, fertile soil, among others.
I see improving soil quality of the site from Elena. Yeah, I mean, everybody, what's cool about this program is we have so many similar, like the root of all of our programs are very similar, but there's so many differences in terms of, you know, how it relates to the community, how like we have some sites that are using their soil, their compost to improve their own community gardens, working with food insecurity, workforce development, you know, partnering with different nonprofits that help in those sorts of fields. So while, yeah, everybody's root is around, you know, that diversion and soil improvement, there's so many other kind of threads you can pull to see the different benefits that trickle through the community. Landfill waste increases biodiversity. Thank you, Lauren. Yes, love biodiversity. Cool. Well, thank you for participating. Okay, so just kind of outlining, you know, here's the basics. Again, like you can pull any thread and see a huge web of, you know, benefits to the community. But some of the ones that we're going to go over today that we can calculate and show in number format when we're applying for grants or whatnot, is in 3 different categories. And these all are going to interact with each other. We'll see when we're calculating. But in the climate space, yes, we're going to reduce greenhouse gases compared to landfilling. We're going to reduce the need for synthetic fertilizers that are a big, you know, climate greenhouse gas issue. We can sequester carbon from the atmosphere when we're applying compost to the land. Ecological, we're going to improve soil structure, improve nutrient content, improve water retention. I know you know all of these things from all the various like soil stewardship training and all of that you've had through CCGS, but you know, just a quick outline. And then social, I mean, this can vary from site to site, but some of the main ones that we're seeing is creating local jobs, aiding in food insecurity, reducing any costs to grow food. Go from there. So we're going to start with the climate and ecological. Those are pretty intertwined when we're looking at calculating. And we're going to start with kind of the heavier stuff, the calculation and models. Hopefully your coffee is hitting this morning. We'll get through that fairly painlessly, and then we'll go to some of the more direct, easier things to understand. Okay, so for climate and ecological benefits, please also feel free to stop me at any time and ask questions. I live in this world every single day, so it might be easy for me to kind of grace over things that need a bit more explanation. But today we're going to go over 3 different methods for calculating the climate and ecological benefits. The first one is a protocol that was created by the California Air Resources Board. Each really has their own pros and cons when you're looking at each calculation method. The pros for the CARB calculation would be it's a simplified methodology. It is specific to California, landfills, and composting facilities. You can separate some of the impacts, like reduction of greenhouse gases from not going to landfill versus the benefit of applying compost to specifically soil erosion. And we're looking at a semi-life cycle methodology. So that means we're looking at transporting the organic material to the different landfill or composting centers, all the way to the end use, the application of compost on land. Some cons would be it assumes windrow composting. So there's equipment involved in the composting that, um, produces diesel fumes, and it won't be site specific. So if you have a program that's collecting residential buckets on a bike and doing an aerated static pile, your emissions are going to look a little bit different. Method number 2 is the EPA warm model. I'm sure you guys have heard about this in some way. It's a very simplified method. It's used widely across the US for a lot of different grants. A lot of grants will ask for this specifically just so you can easily compare from program to program because we're all using the same methodology and the same assumptions. Cons would be it assumes industrial facilities. So again, if you're picking up buckets from your neighbors on a bike, it's going to look a little bit different. It assumes US averages, so we'll see when we compare these in a little bit that the numbers are going to be a little bit different from the CARB methodology. And unless you love reading 700-page technical documentation, it's pretty hard to delineate, emissions benefits from landfill versus soil erosion versus carbon sequestration. And then finally, we're going to go into a site-specific calculation. I'm going to pull a couple resources for you guys to say, hey, this is exactly what our site is doing. We're picking up buckets on a bike. We don't have transportation emissions. We're doing, more yard waste than food waste. So our fugitive emissions from compost sites are going to be lower. So you'll be able to calculate it specifically for your site. But it requires more research and it's more complex. So just providing all of these different options depending on your needs. So number 1, CARB calculation. What goes into this calculation? So CARB and EPA, these are going to be kind of models for you guys to use. I think it's really helpful to understand what goes into the calculation so which one is better to use and which one makes less sense. When you get these slides, you'll have the resource available for you at the bottom here. But what goes into it is we're looking at the emissions avoided from not sending organics to landfill. Then we're adding in emissions reductions from decreased soil erosion, from reduced fertilizer use, and from reduced herbicide use. And then subtracting out any emissions that we are producing from the composting process. So we'll go into each of those in depth. First one, emissions avoided at landfill. You guys know this, methane is generated at landfills when the microbial respiration reaction occurs under anaerobic conditions. So it's that sort of methane output, and then also landfill operations. So those big vehicles that are spreading and moving anything dumped at the landfill and then spreading the alternate daily cover on top of everything that was freshly dumped. What CARB has said, again, for specific landfills in California, specific distances from different regions, and specific compost sites, they say that the metric tons of short ton material separated between food waste, yard trimmings, and mixed organic waste are these specific factors: 0.38, 0.20, 0.33. These are termed emission factors. So they're like a simplified way for you to say, okay, I have 1 ton of food waste material and 2 tons of yard trimmings. I can just multiply it by these known factors and factors given by California Air Resources Board, a notable source for something like this, and convert it into this metric tons carbon dioxide equivalent. A a widely used factor in this world. The next one will be emissions reduction from decreased soil erosion. This is decreased erosion from applying the compost to land. So it's directly related to carbon and water retention. Just a fun fact, they were able to find these factors by applying compost to an area that had just been burned by a fire and a construction site, and compared compost applied versus not compost applied areas after a rain, and found, these erosion factors. So CARB found that compost application relates to 0.15 metric tons carbon dioxide per short ton of compost. Reduced fertilizer use. This is looking at how much less fertilizer you need to use if you're applying compost to land. It includes the 10-year life cycle impacts. So everything from producing the fertilizer, which is a really intensive greenhouse gas process, to application of fertilizer, which has a lot of nitrous oxide emissions that go into the air and water from unused fertilizer. Also found that this is 0.15 metric tons carbon dioxide per short ton applied. And reduced herbicide use. This takes into account the weed suppression benefits of compost application, and assumes 100% replacement of herbicide by compost. Because of the amount of compost you'd have to use to suppress weeds versus the amount of herbicide you would have to use, it's a pretty negligible benefit or greenhouse gas benefit. But, it was taken into account. So, that portion hasn't been neglected for any reason. And then finally, emissions from composting process. This is looking at emissions associated with transporting organics to a compost facility, processing emissions, again, assuming windrows and those windrow turners that run on diesel, and then fugitive emissions from the aerobic decomposition of compost. So that's going to be methane and nitrous oxide, a lot less than the landfill, but there still are some of those emissions. And CARB broke it up between feedstock collection, process, fugitive, methane and nitrous oxide. So if you feel, feedstock collection doesn't pertain to your site, you can kind of get rid of that one. So putting it all together, this is the full calculation. So anything avoided from landfill, decreased erosion, decreased fertilizer, and then the total emissions reduction from composting. So we have a fun little activity. If you compost 1,000 pounds of food waste and 2,000 pounds of yard trimmings, what is the emissions reduction from composting this material compared to sending it to landfill? If anyone's able to try out that calculation, let's take a minute or two to do so. And just type it in the chat or shout it out when you're ready. $620 metric tons CO2 for the food waste. .75, nice. Yes. Okay. So 0.75 metric tons. Paula, you were super close. What we're looking at here is pounds, 1,000 pounds of food waste, and this is in short tons, US tons. So we threw that in there just to make sure that, this stuff can be simplified, but sometimes we get caught up in unit conversion. So pounds and tons, you're going to see that all the time. But you were right on the money. If we, divided that by 2,000, then we would have 0.5 tons. Multiply it by that food waste factor, 0.62. So then you would get 0.31. And then add it to the yard trimmings, and you'd get 0.75. Any questions, I guess, with that before we move on to EPA's WARM model? Cool. Okay, so method 2, a little bit simpler. EPA's WARM model. What they do in their model is they take the emissions from landfilling something, organics, and subtract it from the emissions from composting. Again, they're using US averages in their model. So some of the items might pertain, some items might not. But they're looking at, and they have this model for anything in the waste stream. So it could be fabrics, plastics, whatnot. And you can send it in this model to an anaerobic digester, a combustion facility, a recycling facility. So it's a pretty good model to use if you have anything other than organics as well. But they're looking at the full life cycle associated with anything sent to landfill. So that would be material acquisition, the manufacture of the product, the transportation of the product. A lot of these things don't pertain to organics. We're not really manufacturing our food material, or that's not what they're taking into account in this model. But really what we're looking at for organics is the end of life waste management. So again, transport to a landfill or compost facility, process of, turning with a windrow and whatnot. So how the EPA gives this information is you can go to the site that I've linked, and they have multiple versions. They're updating these every year or two. And it's a big Excel document where you can look at all sorts of materials going to different end-of-life treatment facilities. I pulled out just the organic material breakdown. You'll notice that there's a lot more options here than what was in CARB's model. You can look at dairy products, bread, grains, poultry. But I tried to pull it out exactly in a simplified way, how they're going to show it. So again, we're looking at metric tons carbon dioxide of short ton material. They're taking emissions from composting, process, and fugitives, emissions from landfilling. And what you need to do is subtract the emissions from landfilling, or emissions from landfilling minus emissions from composting, and then you have the implied landfill diversion emissions. Yeah, so again, I mean, if you're composting grass versus yard trimmings versus fruits and vegetables, sometimes this is a better approach because we get a little bit more granular. So again, we're going to take this same example. You compost 1,000 pounds of food waste, 2,000 pounds of yard trimmings. Let's just compare methods. What is the emissions reduction with using the EPA WARM model from composting this material instead of sending it to landfill? Are these numbers big enough for everybody to see to do this? 1.29. All right. So it should be 0.51. Nice, Tim. You're the rock star. Okay, so I mean, this one is kind of interesting. We have a lot of different numbers here that can change the calculation. When I ran it, I did this food waste category, so 0.75 applied diversion emissions, but could easily go with, food waste non-meat or mixed organics. And then yard trimmings, this 0.22 implied diversion emissions. And again, we're going to have 0.5 short tons of food waste because we're using 1,000 pounds, and then 1 ton of yard trimmings. Any questions on that for anyone who wasn't sure how to pick the right numbers? Cool. Okay, well, interrupt me if you have any. Okay, so last one of the calculations, and then we'll get into slightly more fun things. But to calculate for your site specifically, again, this might just be a better method for anyone with, a unique site. We're not using a windrow turner. We're only composting for our neighbors, so our transportation is really low. This just pulls out the types of inputs you're going to need. So the type of data that you're going to want to collect or, generally understand from your site. You're going to want to calculate the transportation to and from the landfill or the compost site. So you're going to want to understand where is the landfill compared to our typical, like the center point of our community. How much closer is the compost site from the landfill? So that kind of change in distance. The trucks used. So, if you're comparing to a big diesel or compressed natural gas garbage truck, which is getting 10 miles to the gallon versus, a little pickup truck or a bicycle or whatever those are. And then the number of trips needed. So, if you're composting the equivalent of a third of a garbage truck every month, let's say we're doing this calculation for a month, we're going to want to know, okay, well, we're only going to calculate a third of those trucks' emissions because they're picking up from other places, whereas for the compost site, maybe we're getting pickup truck deliveries once a week. So we're going to have 4 of those per month. Then we're going to want to know about the composting process, the amount and types, like we were just looking at, of organic material composted, and then the compost application, so the amount applied and the area it is applied to. We won't go into a full example of this, but I just wanted to pull kind of where you would get this type of information and how you would run this calculation. So for transportation, you would look at the distance, the truck fuel efficiency, and you can get an EPA emission factor for each type of truck and fuel type from this link here. They provide, metric tons of each greenhouse gas by heavy duty CNG, light duty, gasoline, that sort of thing. Then we can pull the very specifics. These are pulled from the WARM model on fugitive emissions by material type that you're composting. So this isn't, the fully modeled number that includes everything. This is just the methane and nitrous oxide that's coming off of the pile. And then compost application, you're really only going to use this increased humus formation number because we don't want to include any transportation or anything like that. And they're providing this in the 20 short tons of compost applied per acre. So you're going to need to change units depending on the amount of compost that you're applying and the area you're applying it to. So this is a game of unit conversion, really. Any questions with this one? It's pretty high level, but when it's so specific, it's tricky to. Cool. Okay. Okay, so going back to our benefits, just kind of crossing off what we have looked at and what we still have to do. We looked at greenhouse gas emissions compared to landfilling, synthetic fertilizer use. In those calculations, there was a factor for improving soil structure and water retention. Just on the climate and ecological side, we haven't been able to look at sequestering carbon or improving the nutrient content just yet. And then after that, we'll look at the social impacts. So carbon sequestration and nutrient contents, these are both really hard to estimate using standardized values, just because there can be such a high variability in these different studies and difficulty in isolating what composting is doing versus other factors like cover cropping or whatever other factors are going on in your scenario. Nutrient content is also pretty hard to isolate just because you can have such a varied nutrient content based on the recipe that you're using for your compost. So there aren't any, factors that you can apply from EPA or California Air Resources Board or anything like that because there's just such a wide variance. Other issues around like greenhouse gas accounting in this world is there's this issue of, okay, you might be sequestering carbon for that first year, but we don't know if your, farm management practices are going to change, if you're going to till in the future, and then all that carbon goes back into the atmosphere. So that's another reason why, things like carbon sequestration just aren't put into those built-in calculations for you. But there are alternative options if you feel that this is, a really critical part to, showing the story of what your site is doing. And that's in the form of lab testing. That would be your number one approach. Lab testing can be a little bit expensive. I think all of you guys have experience with that now towards the end of this CCGS program. But option one is kind of lab testing of the actual compost. And option two is lab testing. If let's say you have a community garden or you're partnered with a farm site and you're working on building back their soil, you would want to do a lab test of their soil before and after compost application, or a year into a series of compost applications. And we're going to take a look at a example lab test. I'm sure, again, you guys have already seen one of these, but we can just point out what values we're going to want to see changing in the before and after soil application. Okay, so this is a compost analysis report. Some of the main things we're going to want to see is this carbon value. If we're wanting to look at sequestering carbon, we're going to want to see this number increase in a before and after test. And similarly, if we want to look at increased nutrient content in the soil, we have, I mean, this is just a, example of one. You can get a much more in-depth soils report, but we're going to look at all of these different, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium numbers and watch them increase, or we can see, again, we can do it for our compost and see what the NPK ratios are for just the compost or before and after with the soil. Any questions on soils, lab testing? Cool. Okay. There's other options too, like on-site testing. There's a bunch of different kind of rapid NPK tests if you want to, lab testing can take many weeks, can be kind of expensive. But if you want to just kind of get a general understanding of the NPK of different compost recipes, you can get these rapid tests. There's a pretty cool company called Microbiometer that does microbial biomass, fungal to bacterial ratios, and soil organic carbon tests that you can do, within, I don't know, 15 or 20 minutes on your site. So those are pretty cool methods to just see how things are changing on the interim in between lab tests. Okay, now we can get into online calculators. Most of the online calculators are pretty specific to farming applications. So if you have a composting facility that is, taking in neighbors' compost and then giving, or organic material and then giving away compost for use in their own gardens, these tools aren't going to be the best for you. If you're working with a farm or have a farm or have a community garden on site, these could be a little bit more applicable. But just wanted to kind of show a few examples and provide links to them. So first one is the Eurofins agrocarbon calculator. They're going to ask for, the crop, what type of amendment you're using, if it's manure, green manure, compost, and then it'll give you how much carbon it thinks that you're building up in the soil. Another farm-specific calculator is the Cool Farm tool. They're going to look at, again, the crop. We're looking at, with these, they're kind of combining what is your amendment doing to the soil, but also how much carbon is your crop sequestering and putting back into the soil. So it's kind of that 2-in-1 and pretty hard to separate out just the compost. But they're going to ask for your crop, your soil type, any inputs. So your, amendment, if you're adding any additional fertilizer, fuel and energy, if you have any, tilling equipment. These are, broader calculators. And then it'll put it all together with your carbon and on-farm operations. Any questions? We're going to get into social and economic benefits now. Any questions on any of the greenhouse gas stuff? Cool. Okay. So social and economic benefits, these are going to be very, very unique to, your own site. So I know you guys have at this point seen the CCGS program survey that we've sent out. That's a really good example of how, we're trying to get as much social impact information as we can from a wide variety of sites. But what you're really going to have to rely on for this sort of benefit analysis is surveys and, community engagement and interviews. So another poll, thinking specifically about the community and social benefits. Feel free to also just, again, since we have a small group, shout it out or put it in the chat. What does your site do to benefit the community? You can think along like food insecurity, community gardens, workforce training, those sorts of things. All right, brings people together to talk about sustainability and fertility, food access, workforce development, circular economy. Awesome. Thank you guys. Community garden, food insecurity, education, training site, education. Awesome. Thanks, guys. All really good things. Okay, so some methods just for, collecting data and understanding, how to receive this sort of stuff. So for social impacts, again, the biggest things are going to be surveys, testimonials, case studies. Those are, even though a lot of this information is going to be somewhat qualitative, when it's packaged in a way of survey results or case studies, it feels a lot more like there was, quantitative thought put behind it and, tracking benefits as they, um, grow throughout the years. So there's tools like, SurveyMonkey, Google Forms that are free online for surveys, and those can be made to be anonymous. There's also community interviews and testimonials where you can interview people in person. You can do case studies with partner organizations if, you work with a partner that's a nonprofit on workforce development or training, having kind of a case study or a testimonial from that nonprofit and getting numbers on how many people have been able to get a job after this or get a job with us or those sorts of things are impactful to put into applications and that sort of thing. Economic impacts. There's some sources that I've listed here to help with kind of showing like a base analysis before showing the improvements that your compost facility has made for the community. So you can look at data from the census and intermittent American community surveys, CalEnviroscreen, Healthy Places Index. These are all places where you can see kind of socioeconomic data in your community by, even census tract to see, okay, how many people who live in the area are food insecure and how is this helping that, kind of base data point, or how many people don't have access or live in a food desert. and how does this community garden help people that live in that food desert and now have access to fresh vegetables that you don't need a car to get to, and how many people don't have access to a vehicle. So these are really good places to get that sort of data. And then finally, on shared community goals, each of you work within a community in a context where there's a lot of people wanting zero waste goals. And so places to look for, how you are aligning with broader community goals would be, does your local hauler have a zero waste goal? Does your local government have a climate action plan or a climate adaptation plan, which is going to list their zero waste goal and likely list a goal on working with community, small businesses and nonprofits to make sure that there's equitable food access and we're hitting our zero waste goals. In those plans, they're also going to have possibly local compost procurement goals. So being able to, just find your jurisdiction's climate action plan and show how you align with it, is another really good positive metric. Everybody here is also, within California. We all know about California Senate Bill 1383 and how your work is directly aligning with that. So again, just kind of showing the tree of top down to bottom up people working towards these shared goals. Yeah, so these questions: how has the community compost site helped with food insecurity, cost of food, job creation and workforce development? These are all good things to ask about in testimonials and community interviews. So just put some time in here to have kind of an open discussion on, what other metrics or benefits do you want to showcase for your site? Again, I'm in this like data world every day. So if you have an somewhat obscure ask or just struggling to figure out how you can really showcase the benefits of your compost site, happy to kind of talk through little case by cases with you guys if anybody wants. If you don't want to unmute, feel free to put it in the chat.
Hi.
Hi.
It's Paula here. So I was trying to show to the members of the community garden the impact of the compost station. And I was thinking on like to compare the compost station that is a small station, the impact of composting the food waste compared with the rest like of Bishop, which is our town and it's a small town. So I was thinking, okay, we are diverting this amount of food scraps, and I was researching like just online how much is the trash produced by just one person in the US, like an average.
Mm-hmm.
And per year or per X amount of days. And from that, the amount of trash. And from that amount of trash, what is the percentage of food waste? And what's the CO2 avoided from that, from just composting that amounts. And then I was bringing those numbers to our station, and then I was bringing those numbers to the town of Bishop. And from that, comparing the results of the percentage of those numbers.
Mhm.
So that is a good way to show them like the impact. I was trying to say, okay, from the town of Bishop, this percentage is composted and this CO2 avoided in the atmosphere. Just trying to show them like the impact. Yeah, what do you think about that?
Yeah, that's great. I think using those US averages are a really good place to start. But just so you're aware, CalRecycle collects data every year on a jurisdiction by jurisdiction basis, and releases it publicly to show what um, amount of organic material and also total tonnage going to landfill from each jurisdiction. So you can go to CalRecycle and see for the city of Bishop,
Oh,
um,
really? Okay.
yeah, what are we sending to landfill and what's the percentage of organics? Um, that is one, when we send out these slides, I'll send a link to that.
All right. Awesome.
Yeah.
And another question, there's an impact from like volunteer. This is something that we've been putting in the app, the Glide app,
Mhm.
from the volunteering work. So what are those numbers for when? Yeah, what can be those numbers translated to? It's just education or I don't know, environment awareness. Yeah,
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends on how your site is working with volunteers. Um, I mean, if you're teaching people about composting and how to turn the piles, how to do aerated static versus, um, whatever else, vermicomposting, whatever else you have on site, that could definitely be kind of training and community education, and you can use those numbers of volunteers and total volunteer hours at a site, as metrics to show, each month we have 30 new people coming in to learn about our method of composting and why composting is important. So that would be a really good way to showcase that. Another thing you could take from those metrics are how many, return volunteers you have, if you have any situation where um, you need to show why this community organization should continue to exist or continue to exist in that location or whatever it is. Say, we have 15 volunteers that come back every month, um, or yeah, that feel this is a really important part of the community, that didn't just come here once to learn about compost, but feel that it's so important that they come back every month. That's another, good metric you can pull out of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you.
Of course. Okay, a question about calculating the food produced. Is there a basic way to calculate that based on the compost produced? Interesting. I mean, I don't know. Are you saying food produced like in a garden that you're applying compost to?
Yeah, sorry, I should be more specific with my question. Like,
Oh, you're
I'm
good.
just looking because one of the sites that we had, they had like 16 garden beds for the kids, and they started growing food. So I know it's probably like a plant by plant moment, right? But I don't know. It's asked in our final report, so I just wanted to see like if there's any parameters around that question that I would be useful to everyone, if they're growing food.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think if you want site specifics, it would definitely be about what your site is producing. So you could do, every time you're harvesting, weigh it and say we've produced in this season whatever pounds of food.
Mhm.
But, if you don't have that data, or if you're, giving out compost and it's going to other community gardens and you're not really tracking that sort of thing, I would think that there would be a way of saying that like the tonnage of compost can be applied to X amount of acres, which would help, which, would pertain to, um, a production amount for like that acre. It'd be a little bit tricky and roundabout to do it that way, but if you wanted to apply an inch of compost, how many acres could you apply that to? And then kind of say like, we're improving production on X acres or something like that.
Got it. Okay. Thank you.
Any other thoughts out there? Cool. Okay. Well, thanks for those. Those are, helpful to see what you guys are thinking of, and we'll definitely send out some resources when we send out these slides. So yeah, that's all I had for you guys today. I wanted to put my email one more time just in case anything pops up and you want to, think through something or get some resources, feel free to reach out. I'm happy to help.
Thanks, Naomi.
Of course. Thank you guys. Yeah, hopefully it wasn't too dense, but again, there will be the recording and the slides for you guys available if you need to run any of these calcs. So yeah, again, appreciate you guys spending your Saturday morning with me on on a 3-day weekend. But yeah, keep doing the good work, and thank you all.